Yes. You want to talk about witchcraft? What's up, witches? I'm Allie the Bronx Witch, and if this is your first time visiting my channel, I make videos about Wicca, the religion, witchcraft, the practice, and I do weekly tarot readings. So as I promised, I wanted to bring you guys a video that explains the difference between Wicca, witchcraft, and paganism, because those are three terms that can often get overlapped and confused and are sometimes used in place of each other in a context that isn't quite accurate. And if you are new to your spiritual path or new to any of these three ideas, it can get a little confusing what exactly each of these things means. Before I begin, I will say that defining these terms is very difficult. These terms have changed meanings over the years and in different cultures and in areas, and so trying to come up with one concise definition for each of these terms is pretty much impossible. But I do want to give you a general overview of what each of these terms means and what someone is trying to say when they identify as one of these three things. So let's begin first with paganism. Paganism is often considered an umbrella term for Wicca and witchcraft, but that's not quite right, because there are plenty of Wiccans and witches who don't consider themselves pagan, and of course vice versa. So let's begin historically. Historically, pagan is a term that was first used in the 4th century by Christians who were talking about essentially anybody who wasn't a Christian. Specifically, the term was used to refer to people in the Roman Empire who practiced polytheistic faiths that predated Christianity. Ritual offerings to gods and goddesses and agricultural and earth-based faith practices were the hallmarks of what made a person a quote-unquote pagan, and so many traditions and practices fell under this term. Back in those days, a person wouldn't really walk around referring to themselves as a pagan. It wasn't really an identification that people used for themselves. It was more of something that Christians used to label people who were not Christian. The terms heathen and Gentile also fell into this category. Pagans were criticized by Christians as being hedonistic, sexual, self-serving, and without like a moral compass. And so over time, it became increasingly important for Christians to stamp out pagan practices wherever they could. In some cases, pagan practices were outlawed and ruled illegal, and so they could not be practiced. In other cases where Christians found it more difficult to stamp out those practices would be supplanted with Christian versions. And this is why we see so much overlap between Christian holidays and the Sabbats celebrated on the pagan Wheel of the Year. If it was too hard to get rid of it, Christians would just sort of say, well, now you're doing this for such and such saint or for Jesus Christ, to kind of override the pagan history or overtones of that celebration. In the days before Christianity and Judaism, paganism wasn't really thought of in terms of being a religious practice. Religion as an organized structure is not something that was really known to ancient man. Way back in the day, there were no organized rituals, universal belief systems, or established authority figures that can compare to the Judeo-Christian model. Now, this is different in the Eastern world, where philosophies and religions like Buddhism and Hinduism did have a more organized structure that could be classified as a religion, but this was not the case in the Western world. In the modern world, the term pagan is now used as an umbrella term for anyone who falls into a polytheistic belief system and who recognizes the divine aspect of the natural world. For this reason, modern paganism is referred to as a nature-based or earth-based religion. Modern paganism is also defined by a reverence for the divine feminine, who either stands in place of or alongside the divine masculine. But beyond this, the division of groups that fall under the pagan umbrella term is very numerous and quite complicated. So to simplify things, I'm just going to quickly detail the two most prominent subgroups of paganism. These two subgroups are Mesopaganism and Neopaganism, and I encourage you to do more research on these two subgroups. Mesopaganism refers to pagans that have been significantly influenced by monotheistic, dualistic, or non-theistic worldviews, while also being able to maintain their spiritual practices. Mesopagans are highly influenced by spiritualism, which is the idea that there is a world of unseen spiritual beings who are able to and are interested in communicating with and interacting with the physical world. Mesopagans are also influenced by Aboriginal practices and the indigenous practices of the African diasporic religions such as Haitian Voodoo and Santeria. Some historians would also include the British traditional Wiccan groups in this category. Neo-paganism, on the other hand, is a modern movement that attempts to revive the nature-based practices and the nature-based spiritual paths of the pre-Christian era. Neo-pagans also frequently incorporate liberal values of today with those practices. And non-British traditional Wiccan paths and paths like Druidism would fall into this category. Though it's important for me to mention that an individual does not have to accept any type of a religious path to consider themselves a pagan. I'm just mentioning the spiritual religious paths that you may have heard of and putting them into a box of one of these two pagan groups to help illustrate the hallmarks of these two groups. Witchcraft is a broad term that varies culturally and societally, and so surprise, surprise, it's really hard to define, just like paganism and just like Wicca. But according to the dictionary, it is simply the practice of magical skills and abilities, which then of course leads to the question, well, what is magic? And that term is defined differently across societies and cultures and regions, and makes it really hard to come up with a working definition for what that is. Not to mention, there are plenty of groups of people that engage in practices that some would refer to as magic or witchcraft, but who don't identify as magicians or witches. So what is a witch? What is witchcraft? And how does a person know if they are practicing it? I will cut it down to the most important and what I think are the most interesting elements. First of all, witchcraft is just that, a craft. It is a practice. It is not a religion, a philosophy, or a belief system. So this means that anyone can practice witchcraft, and anyone can call themselves a witch, regardless of any religious, philosophical, or faith system that they may or may not have. In fact, there are plenty of examples of witchcraft in secular society that have no ties to religion or faith in any way, according to most people who practice it. For example, have you ever lit candles on a birthday cake, made a wish, and blown them out expecting that wish to come true? Witch. That is witchcraft. Have you ever taken the picture of an ex that you really hated and burned it to get rid of their memory? Witchcraft. None of these things have any ties, at least in modern day society, to a specific religious background or faith-based philosophy. But those actions are essentially witchcraft. And that is because what magic is at its very root is the concept of taking an intention or a thought, something that doesn't exist in the physical world, and putting in enough energy and direction to create that thing in the physical world. And I talk more about magic and how it relates to spell work in my video on spell casting. There's actually 2 videos on spell casting, and I will link them both up above. Somewhere up there. The analogy that I like to use for witchcraft is yoga. I practice yoga, so maybe that's why, but to me, they just seem to kind of have a similar structure, which is that the practice of yoga, as many of us know, is a physical exercise. It is in fact a practice, something that you do with your physical body on somewhat of a regular basis to achieve a certain end, whether that's physical strength, flexibility, etc. That practice comes to us from the Hindu people and the teachings of the Hindu religion. But we all know that you don't need to be Hindu in order to practice yoga. You could be, and the practice of yoga could be a part of your larger Hindu religious background, but you could also be an atheist who doesn't believe in any religious background and still practice yoga. Witchcraft is very similar. So you can practice witchcraft as a part of a larger religious background or structure, or you could be atheist and have no religious background and practice witchcraft. Or you could be religious and simply practice witchcraft in a non-religious way. Witchcraft and religion can go together. And there are plenty of religions out there, such as Santeria or Voodoo, that incorporate witchcraft into the religion itself. But that doesn't have to be the case. They are not, necessarily connected. Witchcraft can be practiced outside of a religious context. Many witches, including myself, view the practice of witchcraft as a science that we do not yet fully understand because of the scientifically established principle that everything is energy. Everything on earth and beyond, the trees, the rocks, the wind, the water, the stars, the dark matter in our universe, all vibrate on an energetic frequency that can be harnessed in order to create change in the physical world, much like turning on a light switch. When it comes to magic, Raymond Buckland, the man credited with bringing Wicca to the US, really puts it in a great way. So I'm going to read a quote from his book, The Complete Book of Witchcraft. The entire basis for magic is to exercise influence over one's environment. While magic is also, and properly so, concerned with spiritual growth and psychological transformation, even the spiritual life must rest firmly on material foundations. The material world and the psychic world are intertwined, and it is this very fact that establishes the magical link, that the psychic can easily influence the material and vice versa. Magic can and should be used in one's daily life for better living. Each of us has been given mind and body, and surely we are under spiritual obligation to make full usage of such wonderful gifts. Mind and body work together, and magic is simply the extension of this interaction into dimensions beyond the limits normally conceived. So, can a Christian practice witchcraft? Absolutely. How about an atheist? Yup. Satanist? You bet. And I'm going to make a video that goes into depth about why that is and why there's such a misconception that if you fall into one of those religious categories that you are not able to practice witchcraft. But for now, just know that witchcraft in its most simplest form is the act of taking something that does not exist and bringing it into existence in the physical world through the act of harnessing and directing energy. How we do that is the trickier part, and like I mentioned, I have 2 videos on spellcasting that go more into depth about how it is that you actually practice magic. Now let's talk about Wicca, which is a religion that incorporates the practice of witchcraft. And it combines the nature-based divine feminine aspects of neo-paganism with the practice of witchcraft and attempts to bring all of that into a modern world. In England in 1951, the last laws against witchcraft were repealed, which opened the path for witchcraft practitioners to become open and public about their practices. In 1954, Dr. Gerald Gardner began writing openly about the practices and beliefs of his coven, which is a group of practicing witches, of which he was a member. In books like Witchcraft Today, written in 1954, and The Meaning of Witchcraft, written in 1959, Dr. Gardner explained the ways in which his coven, and covens like his, were attempting to recreate the practices of what they referred to as the old religion. A collection of pagan practices that were passed down in purely oral tradition and had therefore been severely eroded and lost over time. Dr. Gardner did his best to collect and recreate as many of these old rituals as possible and compiled them in a book that he called his Book of Shadows. This form of Wicca would eventually come to be known as Gardnerian Wicca. Dr. Gardner set out to educate the world about what witchcraft truly is and what it means to be a witch. And to be clear, Wiccans and witches are nothing like the child-eating, demon-worshipping, hooked-nosed old women that Christians and Hollywood have made us out to be. Since Dr. Gardner's first writings, many denominations of Wicca have been created. And in fact, many of his students went on to create their own denominations. There are so many denominations because we are all different. And just as not one religion suits all people, not one way of witchcraft suits all witches. Most Wiccan traditions are open to people from all walks of life. So following one tradition or another is a matter of personal choice. Just so this video isn't too long, I am going to save going through all of the denominations of Wicca. In fact, I probably couldn't go through all of the denominations of Wicca because, like I said, there are so many. But it's important that you know that the vast majority of Wiccans, at least here in America, would fall in the eclectic Wiccan category, which is basically the descriptor used to describe Wiccans that don't fall into any particular tradition per se. Eclectics draw widely from any, all, or none of the Wiccan traditions to create a tradition of their own. And while eclectic covens do exist, it is quite common for eclectic practitioners to be solitary, meaning they don't belong to a coven or organized group of practitioners. And in case you're curious, I am an eclectic solitary practitioner. Regardless of the denomination or the tradition, there are a few core values that you can generally ascribe to the Wiccan viewpoint. The first is a deep reverence and respect for Mother Nature, and a general understanding that we as humankind have really lost the intimate tie to Mother Nature and her elements that we used to have. Wiccans generally attempt to reestablish that connection by working closely with the earth and respecting all that she provides for us. Another core principle of Wicca is respect and acknowledgement of the divine feminine and the divine masculine. Wiccans generally understand that there is feminine aspect and masculine aspect to all energy in our universe. This is from the tiniest blade of grass to the largest concept of deity. And while some Wiccan traditions might emphasize one over the other, pretty much all Wiccans are of the impression that masculine and feminine energy exists and should be revered, respected, and acknowledged. Another core aspect of Wicca is that Wicca has no governing book or ruling leader. So there is no such thing as the Wiccan Bible. Each Wiccan or each Wiccan coven will typically at some point in their faith path create what's referred to as the Book of Shadows. And the Book of Shadows, if I want to really oversimplify it, is basically like your individual Bible. It's a collection of knowledge that you have gained about the earth, the stars, color correspondences, important holidays and practices, as well as recipes, crafts, and spells. For a Wiccan witch, this book is the most important tool in their magical arsenal. And while most of us work really hard to gain as much education as possible, not just on Wicca, but on witchcraft generally, most Wiccans will consider their own Book of Shadows as their primary resource in how they practice their faith. A Wiccan's Book of Shadows is typically something that he or she works on for their entire lives and will oftentimes pass down to their children or family members. Wiccans also do not have any particular leader. While Dr. Gardner is very much respected for the work that he put into bringing Wicca into the public light and creating a positive narrative around the faith and the practices of those who adhere to it, he is not like a pope or anything like that. Aside from the respect that he gains from what he did to publicize the faith, he doesn't hold a level of importance beyond that. And so it is not necessary at all as a Wiccan to follow the Gardnerian method, the Gardnerian Book of Shadows, or really anything else that Dr. Gardner has published as being the Wiccan way of doing things. Generally speaking though, even though Wiccans do not have a governing document, there are some published works that most Wiccans feel are important or at least instructional as to what it is to be a Wiccan and how it might differ from other religious paths. Most notably, we have the Wiccan Rede, which was written by Doreen Valiente. I always say Valiente. It might be Valiant, but I say Valiente. That's how it looks to me. Doreen Valiente was a Gardnerian high priestess, and she wrote the Wiccan Rede around about 1964. Since her initial authorship of that document, other versions of that poem, it's essentially a poem, but other versions of that poem have been written. So I encourage you to look up the Wiccan Rede and read the different versions of them. None of them need to be something that you strictly adhere to, but it is a good idea to get a sort of flavor for what it is the original Wiccans thought being a Wiccan was all about. The final line of the poem is the part of it that most Wiccans and even non-Wiccan witches are usually familiar with. And that is, "And ye harm none, do as ye will." Now, this line means something different to every single Wiccan, just like pretty much everything else. And so as you grow on your spiritual path, if you choose Wicca as your spiritual path, you will develop your own understanding and belief for what it is that line is supposed to mean. And maybe in the future, I'll do a video talking about my own views about what that line means. But I am not here to push my version of Wicca on to you. I'm just here to give you information so that you can kind of be organized or oriented on your own path. So I definitely encourage you to look up that poem and to give some thought to what that line means to you. Another document that you might find of some interest, if Wicca specifically is the path that you would like to know more about, is the Principles of Wiccan Belief, which was written by the Council of American Witches in 1974. And it basically sets forth 13 different principles that, according to that body, are the principles that Wiccans generally adhere to. And again, I encourage you to look that up and give some thought to those 13 principles and decide for yourself whether or not they make sense for your life and your path. And finally, I will mention that Wicca is what I would refer to as a pseudo-initiatory religion. What I mean by that is it is possible to go through an initiation process within the Wiccan religion. This typically happens within the context of a coven, but is something that could be done on your own. And it usually involves a year and a day of study or apprenticeship as a student, where you study on your own or under a more experienced Wiccan or high priest or high priestess, and learn not only the foundations of witchcraft, but also the basic tenets of Wicca, the religion. After a year and a day of study, if you decide this path is for you, then you can participate in an initiation ceremony. If you do this within the context of a coven, this initiation ceremony will typically earn you a position as a full-blown member of that coven. But the reason why Wicca is a pseudo-initiatory religion is that Wicca recognizes self-initiates, which is not necessarily the case in most other initiation-based religious paths. What this means is you can initiate yourself as a Wiccan. You can conduct your own initiation ceremony and choose on your own to devote yourself to a path that follows the Wiccan principles. And basically, if you determine that you are a Wiccan, then you are a Wiccan, and neither I nor anyone else can say that you're not. You do not need to initiate yourself as a part of a formal coven, organized structure, or have your initiation sanctified by any elder or high priest or priestess. If you are interested in going through a formal sort of study process on your own, Raymond Buckland's Complete Book of Witchcraft remains the sort of quintessential how-to Wicca guide, because it's not only a textbook, but it's also a workbook. And finally, before I wrap up, I just want to talk really quickly about labels. I know I've used a lot of them in this video, and I think the most important thing for you to take away from this video is that none of them matter. There is often an impulse when you first get started on your spiritual path to label yourself as something. I am a witch, I am a Wiccan, I am a solitary, I am Dianic, I am a this, I am a that. And I totally understand that impulse, because if you are going down a path of spirituality and of enlightenment, then there's probably a part of you that to some extent wants to belong to something. And it might seem like finding a label or labeling yourself is going to be key to the process of finding your community or determining what types of spiritual or witchcraft-based practices are right for you. But I really want to emphasize that labeling yourself is not necessary to a full and fulfilling spiritual practice. So, if you find yourself not knowing where you fit into all of these labels, don't worry about it. Don't push it. There is no rule whatsoever that you ever need to label yourself as any of these things. So I really don't want you to walk away from this video feeling like you need to decide now where you fit in this big, complicated world of witchcraft. My only hope is that with this general overview, your curiosity will be sparked and you will want to learn more about the multitude of spiritual paths that are available to you. So I hope that you found this video helpful. If you did, or if you just liked it, please give me a thumbs up. If you have any comments or questions, just leave them for me down below. And of course, subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Click on the bell button so you're notified every time a new video comes out. You can follow me on Instagram at BronxWitch, and I will see you in the next video. Blessed be.